Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Magsman. I'm the manager of public programs here, and we're delighted to have you here tonight for our panel discussion on the Joe Overstreet Taking Flight exhibition. The exhibition goes on view through July 13th, and I also want to remind you all that our galleries are a wonderful place to come during the summer. It's nice and cool, and we always have something new to see. There's a new exhibition of the modern and contemporary permanent collection that's going to be on view starting Saturday, and it includes a Joe Overstreet piece titled The New Jemima. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, so we ask you to please silence your cell phones. We're honored to have such a thoughtful group of speakers with us tonight. Natalie Dupêcher is the Associate Curator of Modern Art and the Curator of the Joe Overstreet Taking Flight exhibition, and she'll be in conversation with Abby Schreiber and Valerie Cassel Oliver. So thank you all again for being here tonight for this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Natalie, who's going to introduce Abby and Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on this soggy and soupy evening. This is our final public program for Joe Overstreet Taking Flight. It's been such a joy to have the exhibition down the hall from here since late January, and as Mary said, its last day is Sunday, July 13th. I am excited to share that the show will travel. It is going to the Mississippi Museum of Art later this year, where it will be on view in Jackson, in the state that the artist was born. So it opens there on November 1st, 2025. And finally, I am thrilled to say that exhibition catalogs are on their way. They're not in the bookstore yet, but they will be in a few weeks. This is an advanced copy. Wow. The book offers 6 scholarly essays, an in-depth full chronology of the artist's life built from extensive archival research, an interview with Corinne Jennings, who was Joe's wife and the co-founder of the nonprofit art space they founded together called Kenkeleba House. And it also features a raft of beautiful new photography of every single work in the exhibition, as well as the installation here in the gallery spaces. So it will be available for purchase at the bookstore later this month, we hope. So, turning to tonight, I am so thrilled and grateful to be joined by 2 friends and colleagues who have been intimately involved with the Overstreet exhibition for some time now and have been instrumental in its success. Many of you already know Valerie. Valerie Cassel Oliver is the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Previously, she was the Senior Curator here at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston from 2000 to 2017, where she organized numerous acclaimed exhibitions, including Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art. At the VMFA, her projects have included Howardena Pindell, What Remains to Be Seen, and The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse, which of course traveled here to CAM and included a work by Joe Overstreet. Valerie holds degrees from Columbia University, Howard University, and UT Austin, and has held leadership roles at the NEA and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. The VMFA is also a treasured lender to the exhibition, and we have so appreciated Valerie's support for all the years leading up to the show actually opening. Abby Schreiber is assistant professor at the University of South Carolina and a contributor to the catalog, for which she wrote a wonderful essay on Overstreet's 1960s shaped canvas constructions. Abby specializes in 20th and 21st century art, performance, and culture of the African diaspora. Her research explores the genre-blurring practices of artists of African descent in the United States, focusing on Black artistic communities, liberation movements, and alternative art spaces. She holds degrees from Oberlin and Columbia and has received fellowships from the Met Museum, the Smithsonian, Crystal Bridges, among others. Her first book examines David Hammons and Black diasporic aesthetics of the 70s and 80s in New York, and her second project explores the archival practices of women artists in the long civil rights area. So now I will ask that Valerie and Abby join me on the stage, and we will start. All right. Everyone hear me? Yes, great. So thank you both for being here. Tonight we are going to focus on Joe Overstreet's work from the 1960s and 70s, the shaped canvases and the flight patterns. And what we were very keen to do is really situate him in the artistic communities in which he was circulating in those years. We've had a number of exhibitions and programs and events that have really focused a lot on Joe's work in particular. And tonight we want to kind of expand it outward and think about the other artists that he was in dialogue with and engaging in those years. Here I'm showing you, just to sort of underscore the point of Joe among friends, among artists, Joe Overstreet at the opening reception of Harlem Artists 69 in July of 1969. Joe is on the far right. He always wore great prints, from what I can tell, from photos of the era. So he's there on the far right, and his two shaped canvases, collectively called Music, are the works that you see behind him, or behind the figure standing on the far left. So just to set the table a little bit, Overstreet, as I mentioned, born in Mississippi, spends part of his young adulthood in the Bay Area and moves to New York in 1958. And crucially for our conversation, he moves downtown to the Lower East Side in 1962. And this is a really critical kind of decision that he takes that sits him in this larger community of African American creatives, writers, artists, musicians, living on the Bowery in what the writer David Henderson would call a downtown Black bohemia. And it's in this environment with these conversation partners and artists that the shaped canvases kind of emerge from these dialogues. He starts making them in 1967. So just to start us going, one shaped canvas construction that's not in the show is this very large work called De Mayor of Harlem, which he created for David Henderson as the cover, as you see, to this eponymous book. And he would also, we'll get to this, created in another kind of portrait of a sense, created this little friend that is in the show called Untitled Sun Ra series in 1967 for, in that case, the avant-garde jazz musician Sun Ra. So to put these on the table, Abby, I know that you wrote about these in your essay. Do you want to kick us off a little bit?
Sure. Well, thank you everyone again for being here, and thank you so much for the nice introductions to our work. I think one of the things I was setting out to try to lay a groundwork for, which Overstreet is such an important example of, is the kind of radical experimentalism and openness that's part of the Black arts movement traditions. And we've been in a moment for some time now where, and this might not be as evident to folks who are not necessarily in an art historical world, or maybe you picked up on this, kind of just coming in and out of exhibitions, but the Black arts movement is often stigmatized for being, not only kind of extremist in views and in values, which, really only speaks to a few opinions that various people had over the course of, decades, but also for being kind of conservative in terms of representation, mimesis, illusion in the visual arts. And I think I've been thinking a lot for a while now about how that's not sufficient to think about Black arts movement visual output. And Overstreet is exemplary of the kind of artist who is really bringing Black arts movement values and the interdisciplinarity of the Black arts movement, right? So the way that visual art, music, literature, right, as exemplified by his engagement with Henderson, who is a poet, and Sun Ra, who is, among other things, a poet, a band leader, a musician, right? That those things were all brewing together as part of the Black arts movement, but also as part of, a kind of intervention into the traditional separation of mediums, for example, or the kind of traditional, ways of mapping geographically where these things were happening, right? Because the Lower East Side is this site of, slugs, this, well-known, renowned jazz experimental arts venue, right? So that was I think a starting place for my thinking, and something I've been thinking a lot about just in my work broadly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely music, but also, as you said, poetry and literature. And Overstreet is also engaged in the Black repertory theater. Mm-hmm. So Amiri Baraka really set that up, and so it is the intersection of performing and the visual arts that he's bringing in elements of representation, which of course then dissolves into abstraction. And this idea about the Black arts movement and its conservatism was about legibility, and it was about allowing the masses to truly see themselves reflected. However, a lot of artists felt that reflection could be represented best with form and color and rhythm and a syncopation of color. And so it wasn't just about the legibility of imagery, but the legibility of feeling, the legibility of a kind of spiritual existence, that those things could also be in tandem with the things that were very, very visually figurative. So Overstreet really kind of embodies a lot of that. And when he comes to New York from San Francisco, he also comes with Bob Kaufman, so, who's a beat poet. And so the downtown art scene was also brimming with people like Amiri Baraka and Bob Kaufman and Ted Jones, who was also not only a musician, but a poet and also a visual artist. So you really do start to see this notion of Greenberg's objectness being embodied by a Black artist. Like, what does the object look like, but more or less, what does it feel like? So I really love these shaped canvases. I had not been truly exposed to them before, so thank you, Natalie, for bringing all of these to light and allowing us to see this sort of more expansive way that Overstreet works.
Yeah. I think that interdisciplinarity, the sort of mixing and commingling of genres that is happening on the Bowery downtown when Overstreet goes there is so crucial in sort of the turn that he makes away from works like the new Jemima, which we'll see on the screen in a little bit, and into these works that are this sort of question of aboutness, like what are they about? Are they portraits of people? How are they communicating that subject matter? And sort of thinking about a way to carry meaning, but in ways that are abstract, is completely fundamental to this shift that Overstreet makes in the late 60s. And one thing that I've often thought about, and that entered my thinking a lot in trying to understand what Overstreet is drawing on in making this swerve away from the rectangular picture plane into these oddball, sort of full of personality kind of constructions, is the example of Ed Clark, who makes one of the first shaped canvases years before in 1957, and does so through the mechanism of collage. So he takes one piece of canvas and glues it on the front of another piece. Overstreet talked about the shaped canvases as collaging shapes together. So I just always had this in my head. But then Ed Clark moves, I think, somewhat more famously to shaped canvases like this one. This is a couple of years later, this oval format, which is not only a shaped canvas, non-rectangular, meant to embody the shape of the human eye with this format, but is also experimenting with new ways of applying the paint here. So applying it with a broom rather than a paintbrush, something that gives you speed and width and much more kind of ground cover, right, than a brush would have done.
Yes, no, there was this wonderful exhibition that was at Hauser and Wirth called The Big Sweep, in which you really do see artists, not only like Ed Clark, that's looking at everyday objects and even objects that are crafted to be tools to be used to apply paint. Jack Whitten is a wonderful example of that as well. And if you look at the surfaces that Overstreet, you can look at the surface of especially the flight works. We were looking at them very closely yesterday to see where a wire brush would have been used and some other tool which we couldn't quite identify. But people like Jack Whitten and Ed Clark, I think the idea of what painting becomes and what it is in flux. And this is a moment of great experimentation, both within and outside of the studios. So.
Yeah, I was thinking too, so Overstreet, for those who might not know, as part of the Black Arts Repertory Theater in Harlem, was tasked with building these, the trucks, right? And, essentially there was this concept of a mobile parade that was sort of about bringing art to the people, right? Which is in line with this idea of making art accessible to the masses, to Black people, to people who might be, feel alienated from museums, who, et cetera, right? So this is part of the BART's mission. And Overstreet, we were talking yesterday about how Overstreet came up in a family where his father's career was masonry, and he had this, kind of training with his father that he put to use in part through the architectural creation of these frames, which if you go back to one of the shaped canvases, maybe not the Sun Ra one, or that works too, honestly, but he handmade his frames. So they're bespoke frames, shaped canvases that, he also meticulously built. And there's a performative dimension to this because that, I'm sort of in the essay making this argument that the shaped canvases have this relationship to the viewer that comes out of a theater kind of staging, right? And there's this element of the building of the stage for BARTs that then translates into the building out of these canvases and their bespoke frames that feels very like to your point about the legibility and how you engage with folks, right? This is also a time when artists are moving from, traditional painting as a canvas on the wall to it really expanding that to become in dialogue with the viewer and to be something that is a three-dimensional object, right? So, but, for me, I was thinking like that is so rooted in this Black art's desire to have this dialogue with an audience.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the kind of publicness and that sort of abstraction in space in a little bit too. But just to add a couple more artists to the mix of Joe Overstreet being on the Lower East Side, he starts to make these shaped canvases in '67, coming out of this experience with the Black Arts Repertory Theater School in '65. He's perhaps thinking about Ed Clark. Another shaped canvas practitioner is Al Loving, who comes to New York in 1968 and is living in this neighborhood too. Befriends Overstreet, Jack Whitten, who Valerie mentioned, William T. Williams, many others, not all of whom we'll talk about here. And Loving later describes this friendship and formal affinity or relationship between their works, saying, we could see that we had all arrived at a kind of abstraction that emphasized materials, which I think is such an interesting way to kind of conceptualize the kind of work that they're making in this late 60s moment. Valerie, do you want to talk a little bit about the septahedrons, this body of work that Loving is engaging with in the 60s?
Well, what's really beautiful is that, he jetsons the rectangular form in an effort to really occupy space in a very different way. While this looks like one large shaped canvas, they're actually modules. So they are actually pulled together, these small pieces that are built together. And Loving was very open to the rearranging and recomposition of these works. So they were meant to be modular. And he showed this work, I believe, as well as another series body of works in the Whitney. He was actually the first African-American artist to exhibit at the Whitney Museum of American Art with this particular body of work, which were meant to be again, very flexible. And so this notion about how one occupies space, what painting is, what painting becomes, that it's not a fixed form, that it can really be arranged, recomposed within space. So really thinking about hard edge geometric forms, the imploding of the rectangular, the rectangle, but the bringing forth of other geometric forms. So it is really interesting time to really rethink painting, but also never really quite letting go of the grid. So there's a kind of resistance to letting go of the grid, and we'll see that also in Howardena Pindell's work, even though they're expanding what it can be.
I had not realized that they were quite so modular in that way.
Yes.
And Overstreet's shaped canvases, this is Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace, that's just on the hallway down there, similarly is not modular, is not rearrangeable in such an open way, although it's interesting that Overstreet will kind of embrace that high degree of variability with the flight patterns just a couple of years later. But Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace is 4 individual canvases that are meant to be hung so that they nestle together, so that it looks like a single object, but they too are individual. And there's a really interesting longer history that we don't have time to get into now, but we could elaborate on in the Q&A about a very important moment in which 2 of the works are separated from this larger group.
What's really interesting, just as you were saying, modularity, is that the way that he paints on the canvases is almost modular, because one of the things I've been trying to think about is how color and pattern aligns or doesn't align. and the symmetry and asymmetry of it. And it's almost like he's using color and pattern in a modular way too, which may be coming from his looking at, African art. It might be among the many other sources that he's looking at that are not, European and American abstraction. But, I'm just thinking, as you're saying modular, I'm like, that actually describes a lot of how he's using shape and color on, in the two-dimensional surface as well as actually three-dimensionally. So it's kind of fun.
And it's very interesting with this. If you go down the hall and actually see it, we see the process of Overstreet. We see the pencil marks. We see where he has adjusted or shifted in the ideas. You don't see that in Loving. And that the modularity allows for the kind of almost a mechanical reproduction. Like you really do feel that there's a mechanical reproduction, which is a kind of element of hard edge abstraction. I mean, even though the hand is very much present, it feels as if it has this sort of mechanical or mass-produced feel to it from time to time. And Overstreet totally jetsons that. I mean, you really do see the hand in everything that he does, which is really quite beautiful. And Loving gets there later with the torn canvases. But after the Whitney show, he literally rejects hard edge abstraction. And what makes it really interesting about the modularity is that it's hard to he sold those things as independent pieces, as discrete pieces. So it's been really hard. I'm currently working on a Al Loving exhibition, and composing that installation that he did for Whitney. It's almost an impossibility because the different pieces are actually gone. So yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. So thinking about sort of the Black arts movement and ways that Overstreet signaled his interest, his commitment, one way that he did that was certainly through his use of titles. So a work like Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace is alluding to Martin Luther King and his speeches, Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace. And in fact, he started creating this work on April 5th, 1968, the day after King was assassinated. And in that context, and thinking about the abstraction and the shaped canvas in particular as a kind of portrait or homage, I also wanted to bring up Jack Whitten's roughly contemporaneous homage to Malcolm from 1970 that is similarly taking this abstract form, but embedding all these sort of subtle references in it, and again, through the title, really giving it this thrust of memorialization. I think both of you have seen the Whitten show at MoMA, which I have not seen yet, might not get to see. But just thinking about the way that these two works, Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace, and then Homage to Malcolm, kind of share this similar formal language, but also a similar ambition for what abstraction is doing in that moment.
And it's really interesting to see how they're spurred by events that happen politically and socially. There was that moment with Overstreet where they're saying, what are you doing, you fools? Don't you realize what's happened? Martin has been assassinated. And then he goes into the studio and starts working on that piece. The same thing with Jack Whitten in that exhibition. There is an image that he created that is an homage to the 4 girls who died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And also the assassination of Martin Luther King. Those sort of open that exhibition, which is his response to the socio-political events that are taking place.
There's also, it's reminding me that there's, numerous artists, as you say, are doing this. There's the Sam Gilliam, April 4th.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And it's interesting, right, because they, even in the midst of these tragic and, just incendiary moments, abstraction feels like this container or this space, this site of open-endedness to be able to process that grief, to make it open enough to not necessarily have to create a representational homage that is, legible in the ways that we've been alluding to. And, someone like Barbara Jones Hogu to, thinking about just the openness of form to be able to relay an emotional or spiritual homage and connection, which remains controversial, right? I mean, when we think about the prevalence of abstraction in memorials, most kind of infamously the Vietnam War memorial, right, by Maya Lin, that was very controversial. And, how can abstraction be this site of memorialization and monumentality that, may or may not stoke a kind of debate and offense for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you have to realize that artists are actually citizens of the world. And so this idea that they're somehow hermetically sealed in their studios, that they're not affected by the world around them. And it is their mode of expression that they can embed in a song or in a visual object or in a play or in a poem, the emotions and their responses, their emotional responses to the things that are happening. That absorption of trauma and the output of the creative it's kind of a cyclical cleansing, if you will, that takes place in the wake of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Witten and Loving and Clark are all in this kind of Lower East Side fertile nexus that Overstreet is entering in the late 60s. And one thing that was so interesting for me to learn about the shaped canvases is that many of them are exhibited that same decade very rapidly, some even in the same year that they are made. And so thinking about the exhibitions, what they're shown with, was another really interesting way for me to think about and to give a better sense for our audiences and for eventual readers of the book, where Overstreet's abstraction came from. Sun Ra was one of the works by Overstreet included in a show at the Brooklyn Museum in the fall of 1969, and it was exhibited near Ellsworth Osby's Ancestral Spirit from 1969. So again, from the same year of the show. And I know Abby talked about this in her essay. If you want to tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I'm obsessed with Ellsworth Osby. This is someone who's another really undersung painter and maker in the 60s and 70s, and someone who I think of as a kind of proto-Afrofuturist abstract artist. And Osby and Overstreet, were in conversation in this sort of Lower East Side fertile Black Bohemia, and Osby was also married to an artist named Jamila Jennings. They were in a major show that was at MoMA PS1, or before it was MoMA, PS1, called Afro-American Abstraction. This was in 1980. So Ellsworth Osby is like, one of the best artists you've never heard of, right? But I think this particular juxtaposition is so evocative because it also speaks to how Black artists in the 70s, or at the cusp of the 70s, were also thinking through a kind of claiming of African heritage and culture and of a kind of, ancient African civilization as this sort of blueprint for greatness, and to think that through a lens of self-determination. But there is a definite futurism to these works, right? And so it's that sense of, turning to the ancient to mine that and rephrase it into a kind of futurist possibility. And so rather than think about, ancient Egyptian iconography or form as this sort of static past, it's getting reinvented and remade as a kind of, forward-looking, innovative claim to a self-determined, Black identification in this moment of Black power. So I was thinking through, those kind of ideas with both Overstreet and Osby, and of course Sun Ra being this, figure who embodies those concepts.
And just to say too that it's almost so obvious, but
Right.
that Jack Whitman's The
Yes.
Homage is in the form of a pyramid, and that too is the kind of like claiming or deliberate use of that form as something that is freighted with this history that they're wanting to, like you say, adopt and mine. And so later that fall, going back to the exhibitions, still in 1969, Overstreet exhibits a number of works at the Studio Museum in Harlem. One of them is Tribal Chieftain, this large octagonal painting that you're looking at on the right. Justice, Faith, Hope, and Peace is also included in that show. And it's reviewed by Frank Bowling, the artist, who is also a major figure in these debates around abstraction, identity, Blackness, Black arts, etc. So this is also by way of saying that Middle Passage, which is in the Menil's collection, will be on view in the modern and contemporary galleries that are opening on Saturday. But how Middle Passage too is a way of thinking about and merging biography, geography, and abstraction, and layering in all of these illusions that still within a kind of avant-garde format, right?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a real mining too of, questioning of modernism. Mm-hmm. And a mining of, as you said, this is a moment where Pan-Africanism, which really begins almost in the 50s in Europe, and it starts to spread wildly, of course, with Americans going there also to Europe, but you have a much larger community making their way over to Europe and vice versa in the 60s and the 70s. But it's the first time that kind of Pan-Africanism is making its way to the continent. Mm-hmm. And not just looking at Egypt, but looking at West Africa, looking at, art from Mali, looking at the Dogon, looking at Nigeria, looking at where those connective tissues are, something other than Egypt. Mm-hmm. So mining language and mining on understanding of modernism, which is picked up from Africa by Europe and then sold and packaged back to America and to African Americans. And it's like, well, there is our own heritage. We have access to that. And whether it's sort of diluted in terms of what I love to call backyard modernism, which is the modernism of our own backyard, the Southern aesthetic, the things that were retained and reframed throughout the whole period of enslavement and regurgitated and remade. That sense of modernism is very much at play. And remember, even though Al Loving is coming from Detroit, his family comes from the South. Mm-hmm. Even though Joe Overstreet is born in Mississippi and travels to California, the South travels with them. And so they are mining a language which is quite accessible to them, mm-hmm. And reframing it under the sort of ubiquitous notion of Blackness. Mm-hmm. And so that whole Pan-Africanism, that even Bowling, he's from the Caribbean and is in London and then comes to the States in New York. There is, again, a sort of notion of a shared language, a Pan-African language. And you see that in the sort of autobiographical notion of the chieftain, because mm-hmm. Joe Overstreet also has Native American heritage. And so there is a kind of like mining of notions of indigenous American forms and colors and patterns and syncopation that also embeds itself in the work. So it does feel very autobiographical to some degree.
Totally. This work is made in 1970 as a Menil commissioned piece for the exhibition Some American History that opens here in Houston in 1971. Also on view in that exhibition is the new Jemima, also going to be on view starting Saturday. And this is a work that has this double date signifying that it's a 1970 reworking of an earlier composition. So it's really a work that can seem like a kind of interruption in this sort of abstract progression and abstract language that Overstreet is developing. But in a way, he's reaching into his back catalog to revivify an earlier composition. So the new Jemima from 1964/1970 is this fabulous large scale, stands on its own, shaped like a pancake box, satirical, pop-inflected take on the mammy stereotype. And as Joe said in interviews, rather than having Jemima at her stove, he gave her a gun. And as she's surrounded by these pancakes that float through the air. And thinking about this sort of public mode of address, it's the way that it stands on its own, its real physicality, really made me think too of this sort of trend in this moment of public sculptures that embrace this abstract language, and thinking particularly of Algernon Miller's Tree of Hope that's in New York that is still, forget which street it's on. My research assistant would tell me. 130th Street. Yeah. But the way that abstraction is retooled in this era as a sort of public gesture too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually wanted, if you go back to the one more, to the bowling, yeah. I actually hadn't realized that this was a commission specifically for the Menil, which for the Some American History show is so interesting, right? Because his family is, from Guyana. He's British. And yet this is, so clearly a work that, as it's called, Middle Passage, is so much about that diasporic experience, and probably one of the rare autobiographical, at least in terms of layering, photographic imagery into the work for Frank Bowling. And so interesting that it's, again, expanding this concept of Americanness through a sense of Pan-American, Pan-African sensibility and claim. So just thinking about that in relation to some American history, right? Which then, if going to the new Jemima, that's an undeniable American history, obviously. But he's setting out, this new definition for what that can be moving forward. And there's a kind of actually, futurist / Afrofuturist way of thinking about that piece too. But yeah, in terms of public address, I was thinking, so Al Miller is another artist who was kind of part of this Ellsworth Osby, Joe Overstreet, using abstraction in a kind of Afrofuturist way. And, this sense of making abstraction part of not necessarily like a public works or sanitizing or cleanliness, but a kind of environmental relation that is, pointing the community back to itself in a way. And so, you also have Smokehouse Associates, who were a group of muralists and abstract painters and artists at this moment who were also designing abstract murals for Harlem. So what does it mean to be thinking about the reach and the, to keep coming back to this word legibility, or, kind of affect of abstraction in a public sphere. What does that do to kind of lift or change the environment? Yeah.
Exactly. And Smokehouse was Melvin Edwards, William T. Williams, and I forget the third.
The two other guys. Bill, oh my gosh, blanking their names. But
Sorry.
sorry.
Google Smokehouse. But all to say, yes, it was about, again, turning away from figuration, but understanding that the presence and the legibility of Blackness did not have to be figurative, that it, again, could be felt, and that was the sensibility of abstraction. That was the impetus to bring abstraction into a kind of more public realm.
And that it could also, be in dialogue with the spatial dynamics and zoning and, relationships of your body in, on the street and in the midst of buildings. I began my essay with Steve Cannon coming down to Houston, going to the Deluxe show, and Houston is a changing city at that point, and to think about abstraction by Black artists in Black neighborhoods in cities that have at those moments been disinvested in, have been dealing with the aftermaths of redlining and of deindustrialization and all of these things. This is an interesting image because of the way, that the shapes in this particular work, Tree of Hope, which also, longer story, but is, named after this very canonical tree that was, this kind of beacon for performers at the Apollo that folks would, rub for good luck and things like this. But it's an abstracted tree. It's done in these, very kind of fluorescent neon colors and forms, and yet it still kind of mirrors in its geometric way the buildings and the windows of the brownstones in the buildings in Harlem. So they're, just the relational quality of abstraction to its immediate spatial environs, I think is something to keep thinking about.
It actually reminds me of Afrocobra, which of course has its anchor in Chicago, but then moves toward the mid-Atlantic. I mean, it splinters off in a weird way, with a kind of nice component of them being in the metro, the Virginia, DC and Maryland area. But this notion of the Kool-Aid colors, the kind of rhythmic patterning, the dissolution of the figurative imagery that just sort of dissolves into modes of color, and how color again conveys presence and existence. So it does still have this sort of illumination of a reflection of the community that it lives in, especially this purple, which is, and the purple and the green and the orange, and it sort of exists on this plane where it's like Kool-Aid colors, there's something very legible about it.
And then the sort of thinking about abstraction in this kind of space is a nice lead into the real movement in Overstreet's work in 1970. We have the new Jemima, which is, as we talked about, a kind of recreation of an earlier work. But the real movement that Overstreet does in that year is to go off the wall. North Star is a really important work in how Overstreet conceptualizes that. He later says something along the lines of, after I did North Star, there was nowhere to go but up. And so the next move that he makes is to lose the stretcher bars. This is Hoodoo Mandala from 1970 that is still parallel to the wall, but hung off of it, about 8 inches from the wall. And then he starts to really shape that space. So rather than having it parallel with the wall, the canvas starts to activate and dance in this really complicated and exciting and architectural way that also is calling on the viewer's body in really interesting ways. There are also ones that are fully three-dimensional that you're really meant to walk around. But this is all within a pretty narrow space of time that he makes these sorts of turns away off the wall and then into full space. And another interesting thing just to note in this evolution is that by now, although it's not, he's going a bit back and forth, but he is no longer living full time in New York either. It's when he goes back to California to teach at an art school in the Bay Area. And so it's it's one of these perhaps unanswerable questions, but what is sort of shaken loose by leaving New York and entering a new environment, a new cultural and literal environment where he starts to kind of torque canvas in this new way.
Mm-hmm. I think it's triggered by this notion of migration. Mm-hmm. And the idea that as a child, they were itinerant for a while. His family, that they moved, had a very nomadic life before settling in California. So what this reminds me, and he is very keen in reminding us that this is an exploding box. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, it can almost fold back into a box. I think it's this idea of having to pack and move. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of taking flight, and he talks about especially that three-dimensional piece as being kind of a tent, mm-hmm. meant to be nomadic, and this notion that maybe this idea of moving again brings up to the fore this idea of the itinerant existence.
Mm-hmm.
I love that so much because I've been thinking a lot about abstraction as flight, which is something Adrienne Piper says like in the 80s, or she's like, abstraction is flight. And I've been really sitting with that. And, when you think about even someone like David Hammond's The Flight Fantasy series, I mean, beyond having it be really, in name or in title, there is this sense of, what does it mean to think about the open-endedness, the kind of iterability, the just sense of continuation and uncertainty, and inability to be static. That is also part of abstraction and part of these works. And I love that idea that the physical, kind of sense of migration, as well as that sort of conceptual migration that's happening for him, that's really bound up in this.
Mm-hmm. We are going to scoot through to some other practitioners in this decade, in the early 70s, that are also taking their abstraction off the wall, just as a closing to the evening. But just briefly to say that in 1970, Overstreet's mandalas, this is a work called Indian Sun that you see on the lower register, are published in Time magazine with a bevy of other abstract practitioners: Sam Gilliam, Melvin Edwards, Richard Hunt, Daniel LaRue Johnson, who's above him there. But that is one of other artists at the time that are reconceptualizing painting and taking it off the wall, making it architectural, having it call on the viewer's body in different ways. So we'll just finish by quickly looking at this Howardena Pindell soft sculpture, at Al Loving again, and then at Sam Gilliam. Mm-hmm. But Valerie, I know this is a work that is very close to you.
Yes, we acquired this work about 2 years ago at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Howardena did not make a lot of soft sculpture. Mm-hmm. She did the soft grid, which is in the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. This work, and then another found work recently that's still at Garth Grennan Gallery. But this idea, again, of the grid and reimagining paintings, because this is a canvas that's been painted and rolled. But it's also meant to be what does it feel like as an artist to move one's work. I mean, Howardena talked about, this idea of flexibility and movement. So getting back to that sort of notion of being a nomad, how you can pack your work up and fold it and move it from one place to another. So we're very fortunate to have this. And I was very fortunate to do that exhibition with Naomi Beckwith. So I don't want to take full credit of doing it. It was a Herculean task that we both engaged in with.
It's so great to think of this work as, rolled, because that's similarly how Joe talked about the flight patterns and their portability, that you could just roll them up and throw them over your shoulder and take them anywhere. And in theory, install them anywhere. They are meant to be variable and new in a way every time that they're installed. Another artist who we looked at already, Al Loving, with his hard-edged geometries, really radically reconceptualizes his practice just a few years later. And this piece is from the mid-'70s, is making these paintings from his own torn and reassembled canvases. And then we'll finish with Sam Gilliam, who started making his drape paintings in 1968. So is, again, part of this whole milieu of artists that are rethinking painting and how to take it off the wall, how to make it not rectangular, how to make it signify differently. And I've thought a lot too about the what it means for the paint and the canvas really to drape, and how that is sort of has a fundamental difference to the real tension and tautness that Overstreet insisted on in his architecturally installed flight patterns from the same time. But yeah, any final thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking of the nodding that Sam uses, this versus the nodding that Overstreet uses, which of course is a reference to the sort of strictures and limitations of the Black body, particularly in the South, and those knotted noose pieces are meant to reference lynching. And so again, whereas they leave the South in many ways never leaves them in terms of understanding, even by moving westward or northward, that these realities still follow. And so it is interesting that Overstreet never shies away from that stays really part of his practice.
Yeah, and that abstraction can be a way to kind of hold that and yet to move through and with and beyond constraint. Right? And I think that's another thing that I'm thinking about in terms of abstraction as flight, right? Because that history is there, it's material, and he really embeds that materially. And yet he's also thinking about how do we, move through the constraints on the body and on, a kind of Black relation to American history and geography through a form. Yeah.
I think we'll leave it there, and I think we may have time for just a couple questions. Thank you. And Tony will come around with the microphone.
Thank you so much. This was such a thought-provoking discussion. My question is for Valerie. At the very beginning of the discussion, you said you walked in and saw all of the flight patterns on the wall for the first time. How did that feel?
I mean, it's pretty remarkable, one. And again, it's, homage to to this one here who really persisted in ensuring that those works came to life here. And so they're not all of them, though. No. But there's a preponderance of them. So, I mean, the 1970s takes a large swath of the exhibition, and it is beautiful to see them and to see the sort of variations that he brings to bear with those flight pieces, that they go from the exploding boxes to the mandalas, to other shapes, and you really do see the variance that artists are constantly evolving in their studios. They may have a particular idea that they are moving forward, that's the through line, but the presentation is constantly shifting. So it was really beautiful to see that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for having this. It's wonderful. I just happened to have engaged a couple of these people, and of course Sam is my favorite. My question is, because I'm glad to see it, what intrigued the three of you to bring it forth so we could see it?
Well, I can speak to that for this exhibition, which is that it arose in really large part from the fact that John and Dominique de Menil were early champions of Overstreet's. And so in 1972, presented his flight patterns here in Houston first at Rice and then at the Deluxe Theater. Overstreet was the first artist to have a solo show at the Deluxe. They collected 3 flight patterns in addition to the New Jemima. And so the exhibition has been kind of in the institutional mind for almost, not quite 10 years, but since 2018. And at that time, some people from the museum, Michelle White, Rebecca Rabineau, met with Joe Overstreet, and he knew of our wish to put together an exhibition that would really celebrate the flight patterns, contextualize them within the rest of his practice, and be a real moment to see the work again in Houston after it was shown here so memorably in the early 70s. So that's where this particular show itself came from.
Well, I'm always I mean, really, do you need to ask? I mean, I'm always, as a student of Howard University, I mean, a lot of these artists were in my orb. I met many of them. I was certainly exposed to them, and it is always a kind of North Star, literally, figuratively, for me, to be able to bring to the fore that which is in plain sight, but often overlooked. And so it is wonderful that these artists, and really a hat off to Dominique and John de Menil, who really championed and embraced art in its full diversity very, very early on. And it's wonderful to have been a Houstonian, to have grown up in this city, and to know and to have known artists initially because of their vision. So it speaks a lot to my own interest, but also the benefit, the great benefit of knowing all of the different narratives that were present in the field, because they informed one another, and you can't, project only one element or one narrative of the history of art. It really does. We all lose when we don't know the fullness of the story. Many of these artists were in conversation with one another, and it wasn't just segregated conversations. There was a lot of exchange that took place, and there were a lot of different influences, and not just looking at one thing, but looking at many, many different ways of working in the field. And so for that now to be a more prevalent narrative within mainstream museums is so vital. And we've come too far to allow these narratives to now close again. So it's wonderful to see the Pindell really taking the lead and moving this needle ever forward in the vision of the founders themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It's just always so lovely to like be here as you talk about this work and also just share about the process. I was so struck by the idea of the kind of talking about Howardena Pindell and the kind of rolled up, and how Overstreet also thought about this opportunity to not just kind of take the work off the wall, but then also be able to roll it up and really transport it. When I think about that, I like very much think about it as a Black feminist methodology. I think about like Dinga McCannon and the Revolutionary Sister and the flap kind of going down so it could go into her car because, you know, transportation. So I'm just curious, with Howardena, I'm terrible with remembering artist timeline, but 1970s, beginning of MoMA for her. Is that right? A little.
Was the 1970s
the soft sculpture that we saw?
That soft sculpture is it from 1970? Yes, and I think the grid is around the exact same time, if not a year later. And you know, there was a feminist aspect to the softening of the grid, if you will, which was such a masculine form. It was in many ways allowing the grid to become flaccid, if you will. So this idea that you're softening this whole like movement, which has been built on this hyper masculine sensibility. And so the use of soft materials, the use of resin, what they called, Lucy Lepard, why am I, eccentric abstraction. Yeah, it's this idea of softening abstraction in a way that feminizes it. And men and women were both engaged in this as well. So, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I just was very curious if Overstreet also would have thought of himself as a feminist, if that was something he was thinking about, or if this is something he was adopting, you know, appropriating, you know, from Black women artists around him at all.
I think that would be more nomadic. I don't see Overstreet as being a feminist. I may be wrong, though.
Corinne Jennings was such an important steerer of his, I mean, his thought and career. I mean, maybe this is pre-Corinne, but the fact that that's in the ether and the fact that, you know, you're making that connection and it's a similar moment to, I mean, the fact that all of these people were talking, right? And that these conversations are pervasive, and that, you know, someone like David Hammonds is, of course, also, you know, a subscriber of the belief that, like, I'm packing it in and you might also throw it away because, you know, this is so easily accessible that it doesn't even look like art. But I think I love that idea that there's a Black feminist methodology behind that, because at some level it really comes back to access. And I think that is first and foremost something that, you know, thinkers, Black feminist thinkers were really promoting on the forefront, right?
Yeah.
And is really behind the decision that Sam Floyd and Corinne Jennings and Joe Overstreet make to open Ken Keleba House in 1974 as a place to have exchange and be a multidisciplinary space for performance, but also a place to exhibit artwork, given that so many more traditional venues were not available to them or were not open to their work. And Ken Keleba is in existence and still run by Corinne.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. One more.
Linda.
Yeah.
This is probably requires a whole nother panel. But the times that you're talking about, the work, and this was made the late 60s, early 70s, was an extraordinary time in New York. And there was so much going on in terms of, obviously, the civil rights, the Vietnam War, artists confronting museums.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much going on, and looking at this work, you don't get a sense of that at all. Could you easily somehow summarize the relationship of Overstreet and these artists and their abstraction to the context of New York and what was going on? And I don't remember when Harlem on My Mind happened.
Oh, 69.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So it was full of tension and maybe not quite as much as we have right now, but it was a very rich time with so many different sensibilities going on. If you could maybe put that in a little bit into context.
Yeah, Harlem on My Mind, which was protested by residents of Harlem and many, many more, because it purportedly was about celebrating Harlem itself, but involved Vanderzee, I believe, was the only artist that was actually featured in the exhibition, but it was more of an anthropological ethnography kind of presentation of Harlem, which totally created a sense of erasure for all of the burgeoning art that happened from the Harlem Renaissance to the present moment in 1969. This also 1970 was the year prior to the Whitney, where there was protests because there was not a sort of African American curator involved in the what's his Contemporary Black Art in America exhibition, which Overstreet refused to be a part of.
This work, We Came From There to Get Here, was slated to be included in that exhibition in 1971 at the Whitney. And Overstreet was one of a number of artists who pulled their work from that show. So yes, Overstreet and many of the artists that we talked about are part of these debates and protests around the exclusion of Black artists from exhibitions and museums, in particular in the late 1960s and 70s, which is also around the time that the Studio Museum in Harlem opens, where Overstreet exhibits, and the birth of a lot of other alternative art spaces, in addition to Ken Keleba, that are in part about sort of finding different ways to exhibit and sort of make a different art world.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is an enormous question that I think, are all deeply invested in to a certain extent. But I will just say, Howardena Pindell is a great example of someone who actually has her toe in all of these different spheres and is navigating as a Black woman artist, right? The limitations of each of those spheres and how they do or do not intersect, right? So she's literally working in the bowels of MoMA. She is finding the limitations and constraints of a largely middle-class white feminist art movement. She's also feeling criticism or criticized by Black male voices in the Black arts movement. So she's really navigating all of these different spheres that are all percolating in this exact period.
Right.
So she's actually a great example of someone who maybe this exact work doesn't show it, but I think what we've been speaking to is the ways in which these works actually do resonate on a bodily level, on an affective material level, on a spiritual level, to different degrees, right? These experiences that artists are having with this larger intersection of art worlds.
Exactly. In the foundation of AIR, it's not just Black artists, it's the feminist artist movement. Women are locked out of these predominantly white mainstream institutions. Black artists, there's GAG, there's the Art Workers Coalition. There is a multiplicity of movements that are coalitions of artists who are actively resisting. And then there's that infamous Yoko Ono, John Lennon, also protesting, this notion of what art is and how it gets commodified. So there's a consumption of art. There's that whole element of artists not wanting to be seen as consumer their work as consumer objects to be consumed by institutions. And yet there's a whole group of people who are asking, not even asking anymore, demanding to come into these institutions. You have Lorraine O'Grady's, famous performative works as well. So it is a moment of tremendous transformation. It's not the beginning, but it is a build-up of the momentum, which is, really Suzanne Callahan's 1971, which you can buy at the bookstore. I just saw it. It really encapsulates at least 4 distinct events that happen in 1971 that reshapes and reframes the art world. Yes, thank you for your question. And you lived it, Linda Shearer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.